Thanks so much for joining tonight, and we're really pleased to have Professor Garfield Gini-Newman from WorldVuze University of Toronto facilitate this session, which is really a getting started webinar on 5 powerful learning opportunities to use WorldVuze with your class. So it's a great combination of the Critical Thinking Consortium pedagogy, which Garfield has really honed, and using the WorldVuze technology in powerful ways. I just wanted to introduce Garfield in particular, and I want to read a couple of pieces about him. So Garfield is a national senior consultant with the Critical Thinking Consortium and associate professor at WorldVuze. He's worked with thousands of teachers across grades and subjects, and was previously a teacher and curriculum consultant, and has led major projects exploring the use of digital technologies to enhance critical, creative, and collaborative thinking. Garfield speaks across Canada and internationally, and has authored 8 books and several chapters in books and articles. He has also taught in the faculties of education at York University and the University of British Columbia, and his most recent book, Creating Thinking Classrooms, is in its 5th printing, and it's being used in schools across Canada, the United States, Europe, and the Middle East. And we're really pleased to have Garfield here today, and please feel free if you have questions during the session to type that into the chat box, and we'll take it from there. Right, I'm going to turn this off and let you go for it, Garfield.
So we only have a bit less than an hour, and so we'll move quickly, but some stuff will be review and some will be new for people. So where we go. I just want to set this in a little bit of a context, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this structure called, yes, it is being, I believe it's being recorded right now. And I think will be posted, I believe Julia can confirm, but I think will be posted on the WorldVuze website later on. So I just wanted to set a context with TPAC, or Technological Pedagogical Content Knowledge. And this notion was developed in 1986. Lee Shulman published a research study called PCK. So this is Shulman's research. In there for you, and he developed this theory of PCK, pedagogical content knowledge, and the essence of what he said at the time is that effective teaching requires both an understanding of sound pedagogy plus an understanding of the content that you're teaching, that just one or the other by themselves is not enough for effective teaching. And then in 2006, this theory was republished as TPCK, or TPAC, Technological, Pedagogical, and Content Knowledge, with technology being added to it. But the point being, and you see in the center here, I've placed learning at the intersections, engaging kids in meaningful learning that helps them understand the content and conceptual level, that uses sound pedagogy and uses technology to advance that pedagogy. So WorldVuze is that blue circle. It's ways in which technology can actually be used in a powerful way to enhance student learning. There's many uses of technology that actually do little to support student learning and are more bells and whistles than they are really good support. So what we want to look for is how do we integrate that. So for my purposes this evening, I'm going to be focusing primarily on the pedagogical circle, the orange circle. But what we want to look at is how do they come together. So I just put the slide in just to remind you, and just as a bit of a context, WorldVuze is, and I been supporting it for a few years now because I think it's an amazing idea, amazing structure that is built on the invitation for kids to pose rich questions and to respond in thoughtful ways to those rich questions. Now, the rub is most kids, when simply asked to generate questions, produce fairly superficial questions without being trained in how to frame good thinking questions. What we find is most kids pose questions that are largely content-driven. So one of the dangers with WorldVuze is if the quality of the questions being posted by students for others to respond to does not invite thinking or does not push thinking, then what we're doing is we're simply using it to post correct answers, as I can put it that way. So the real power in WorldVuze that I've seen, that we've seen over time, is when teachers are able to bring a sound understanding of good critical thinking questions to WorldVuze to support them. So that's where we want to build. And it's in this orange, as I've highlighted in yellow. So I'm going to just set a bit of context, and you're going to see it's not always going to be about WorldVuze. I'm hoping your experience with WorldVuze will bring that to it. I want to, as they say, focus on pedagogy. And I want to start with this quote, or the statement from John Seely Brown that I've quite liked for a while now, where he said technology has the potential to be a curiosity amplifier. And I think WorldVuze fits very nicely into that, because if I'm wondering about something, I wonder how others around the world would respond, I wonder how others see us. I can post questions on WorldVuze that invite others to weigh in on an issue or to give me some feedback. So this is this notion of curiosity amplifier. But I want to show you, without helping kids learn how to learn thoughtfully, to think about what they're receiving. So I may have a curiosity amplifier, but I go online and I find an answer. Do I filter it? Do I think about it? Let me show you an example. This is the airport in Gibraltar. And I was first shown this when at a conference on brain research and brain research and the use of technology. And the presenter essentially said, this is what happens with bad planning. So I'm going to ask if one of you or a few of you wouldn't mind, what do you notice in the picture? And why would the presenter have said this is an example of bad planning? You just either use your mic and turn on the mic and offer a thought, or type something in the chat window. Why did the presenter present this image as an example of poor planning? Okay, traffic jam. If you look closer, what's causing that traffic jam? Al, it's an interesting thoughts. Lane interrupts the flow of traffic. Okay, so let me just. So as I said to you, this was shown as an example of bad planning, and as you pointed out, the plane. So the only runway in Gibraltar cuts across the only major road. And so there creates a traffic jam as cars have to stop and wait for the plane to take off. And you can see pedestrians as well. So when I asked the question, I was setting this up, I had a student sitting beside me on a flight, and I typed in the question I just pulled up now, poor planning or innovative problem solving. And he immediately said, oh, it's definitely poor planning. And I asked, well, what do you know about Gibraltar? And he said, not much. I said, well, what if I told you a little bit more about it? Let's see what you decide. Now, by the way, my point here is in the absence of background knowledge, without knowing about Gibraltar, it's hard for students to make a thoughtful decision. So I said, well, this is Gibraltar, which you're looking at from the tip at the bottom of the page up to the second piece jutting out in the bay at the top of the picture, and that's the border with Spain. 1715, Gibraltar was captured by the British, and they've held it since. And until about 20 years ago, the Spanish would not let you cross from Spain into Gibraltar. So the British needed some way to land planes on their territory And I said to the student, the other thing you might want to think about is the Rock of Gibraltar. So here's the Rock of Gibraltar. Runs through, as you can see, the middle of this picture. And you need a runway as wide as you can see it here. And you'll notice the only major road is across it. So if this is bad planning, what are some alternatives? So if you could just type again for me in the chat window, what would be some alternatives if we think having traffic stop for planes to take off from land is not a good idea, or someone said it's not ideal? What would be a better solution, or what might be an alternative to stopping traffic? It's going to give you a minute to share some thoughts on what you might do rather than stop traffic. Okay, so the bridge, I'm wondering how does that bridge work so that the plane doesn't hit it? And then you've got a tunnel, boating from the nearest island, so find the largest island nearby that you could land planes on. Variety of options. Let me ask you, okay, tunnel works better. How much would it cost to build the tunnel, do you think? Yeah, tunneling underneath, a lot of engineering, a lot of work to do. So what if I showed you, so we pulled up these options, these are the number of flights that were in June of this year into and out of Gibraltar on a given day. So when you look at the number of flights, how busy is the airport, is it worth the investment? And then what I would ask students to think about, so given the options we have, build a bridge, build a tunnel, come in from another island, or stop traffic till planes leave, come and go, and we use a set of criteria, which would be the best solution that will be least disruptive, that will be the most cost efficient, and be the safest and most practical for pilots to be able to land. So what I want you to see is, by framing my question not as a list, why would people do this, or a statement, this is just bad planning, but inviting students to weigh in. Then they have to make a judgment, and then I built their intellectual tools, what we call intellectual tools. I built some background, gave them some criteria to consider, and now what I would do is invite them to make a thoughtful decision. And this is the kind of framework that we're proposing that will enhance students' experience with WorldVuze. That if they're posing questions to others that get at a richer understanding, an evidence-based response, and students weigh the evidence in that way, we get a richer discourse online through our students. So I want to just pause for a moment and ask you, what should be the defining features of a 21st century classroom? So what I'm really asking here is, what are the competencies that we should focus on? I want to give you, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you to each try to type in at least one or two competencies that you think are essential for our students to succeed in the 21st century world. What would be some of the things that schools need to focus on to help prepare kids for the 21st century? I'm going to pause and let you type in some thoughts. Wonderful, thank you. So it's interesting, we've got critical, creative, and collaborative thinking going on, access to knowledge and information. I want to come back to those in just a moment, just bear with me. I just want to share with you. Do some of you remember, this is a PowerPoint that went around 2006 called Shift Happens. And the essence of the PowerPoint, and I've just pulled a few of the slides, is that we're preparing kids for jobs that don't exist yet. We're preparing kids to use technologies that haven't been invented yet. And we're preparing kids to solve problems that we don't even know are problems yet. So this kind of set up the notion that the The world is rapidly changing, and it's unclear as to where we'll be in the future, because we don't know what the jobs kids will do, what the problems they'll have to solve, or what technologies they'll use. So you may have seen that, but I want to suggest to you another piece that goes with this. This came out this summer, this study, I think it was in June, that suggests that robots, as you can see, will replace 42% of Canadian jobs in the next 20 years. That 42% of the jobs we do can be automated and will be over time. By the way, interestingly, of the top 5 jobs that are safe, 3 of them are in education. Elementary teachers, secondary teachers, and early childhood educators. Those are 3 of the top 5 jobs that are not likely to be replaced because of the nature of the work that teachers do. I put this up, though, for you to think about and to look at for this reason. If automation can replace a lot of the jobs we're currently doing, what is the challenge that gives us as teachers in terms of how we prepare kids for a world in which the kind of factory work that they may have relied on in the past will simply be replaced by more efficient means? I'm going to just pause and let you your thoughts. Given that, if this is true, 42% of jobs currently being done by Canadians will be replaced, what challenge does that give us in education? Okay, Andrew, as you know, most jobs don't exist. How do we prepare kids for that world? The jobs that are currently here aren't here in the future. What do we do to help our kids adapt? Great. By the way, just as you're thinking about this, I worked with schools in China this summer, and I think we have an image of Chinese education being very rote and very traditional. It was fascinating how many times I saw in the media in China that the focus increasingly in China will be on creativity. That they're realizing what they call the new economy. And by the way, imagine if 42% of Canadian jobs would be lost to automation. How many jobs in China could be lost to automation? How many jobs in China might get replaced? And so they're putting a huge focus on creativity and innovation, realizing that in the knowledge economy as we go forward, that's what's going to sustain them. So I wanted to set that up and to say to you, notice earlier I asked you, what are some of the core competencies? You had the first 3 in a row: critical, creative, and collaborative thinkers, access to information, I would argue in a global context, multi-literates, and now if we just pause and think about all of the connections that can be made, used well, used effectively, WorldVuze can promote, create critical thinking, can invite kids to innovate or be creative in terms of thinking about world issues and challenges, invites collaboration, not just within your school, but across Canada, across North America, and across the world. But there's a chance for kids to put their heads together from multiple backgrounds, diverse countries, to solve a problem. The very nature of having kids working together to solve problems gets at that global thinker. And having kids share their learning and share their ideas through a variety of mediums can help with the multi-learning. So I think all of the competencies that are being talked about and being touted across Canada these days, I think are addressed nicely by WorldVuze, assuming that we're making effective use. So I'm going to ask you just to respond to this for a moment in terms of your work, either in the classroom or your work with WorldVuze or other work. The top quote that you see is one that I encountered on Twitter. And as you can see, it says that a teacher's job is to inspire students and get out of their way. So I'd love to see a response from you that you might love that, you might have concerns about that, you might dislike that. Could you just comment on that statement? A teacher's job is to inspire students and get out of their do agree that our job is to get kids excited about learning. I'm just going to wait another little bit as I see some thoughts coming in. Balance of some sort. Hillary, I'm going to assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that balance is to say, yes, our job is to inspire, but I think you're saying that you're not so sure we can just get out of their way now. And I see it's inspire, but guidance to help students. I think I saw Quentin in a similar way. You like the inspire, but sometimes they need help. I agree with you. I have to tell you, I am concerned about that statement at the top. It seems to me to be a dangerous road to go down. To say, earlier when I said to you, teachers are in the top 5 jobs that are safe, if we're just getting out of the way, I'm not really sure why we would need teachers. I mean, we can inspire kids with lots of things. Add a video. There are lots of ways to inspire kids. And if all we're doing is getting out of their way, why not stay at home? Why do kids need to come to school? Like, it seems to undermine and not value the important role that teachers play. As you say, Hillary, prompting, prodding, give a sense of direction, rigor, and so on. So I'm worried about statements like this that undervalue the important role that teachers play. But what you see on the bottom is a statement I had from a student in a practice teaching block who delivered a very transmissive lesson with no invitation to think. And when I said to him, that lesson really didn't involve any thinking, the response was, well, that's what my AT has told me several times, that sometimes you just have to teach content. You can't do critical thinking all the time. Any thoughts on that? Is it true that some days you just have to teach content? Or could you argue that, in fact, critical thinking can be present all the time? What would you say to that? Are there days we just pump out content to kids? Or is every day an opportunity? Okay, let me. Good question, Quentin. It's possible, but is it way more work? Content enhances critical thinking, absolutely. Let me just clarify something as we dig into this evening on critical thinking. And I'd like, and being explicit about how to be critical thinkers about content. I mentioned to you my student was delivering a lesson, beautifully framed PowerPoint, like lots of good content, really nicely done. And on each slide, he highlighted the one fact, the one point on each slide that was most important for kids, and they had to record that. And I said to him, and by the way, this was a grade 10 academic class, and he was highlighting which of the 4 points they needed to record. Well, that's a missed opportunity for critical thinking. Having kids do something as simple as, here are 4 possible answers, here are 4 facts, here are 4 of something. Not all of them are equally helpful. They could be all true, but they're not all equally helpful. If I've given you a provocative question, I give you 4 facts, and you have to decide which 2 are most important to copy down. I've engaged you in critical thinking. So notice, critical thinking doesn't have to be the project at the end. It doesn't have to be the task that takes more time. It's just the way we frame our question. So up goes the slide. Here are 5 facts. I want you to write 2 down that are most useful in answering the question I posed at the beginning of the lesson. Here's 5 facts. One of them is not true. Can you figure out which is the false one? Talk to it apart. These are small things I can do to put thinking at the core. In terms of worldviews, making sure kids are being thoughtful about what kind of questions are we posing for others to answer. Is it simply recall? Are we asking them to list things? Or are we asking them to make judgments? So, for example, we post a question that's multiple choice on worldviews. How do we make sure that the kids are framing it in a way that's doing more than just telling me about it, but it's getting me to make a judgment? So I wanted just to frame this way, and I want to show you this notion that we should just inspire kids and get out of the way. The graphic I'm showing you now is by John Hattie. He released this in June of this year. And he highlights on this, on the right side, the blue, are the top effects that are making a difference for kids in classrooms. The 6 top effects and the power of them. And the on the left side, the red area, are the 6 bottom effects. Things that are having the least impact or the least able to defend the practice because it's not making a difference. And what I want to show you is, I know you can't read the graphics, I'm just pulling out a couple. This notion that inquiry should be kids learning what they want to learn or kids just exploring what they want. Student control over their own learning has a 0.04 impact. By the way, 0.4 is the cutoff between having a significant impact or not having an impact. So 0.04 is a very small, very insignificant. It almost is in the negative zone. Kids don't know what they don't know. They don't know how to frame good questions if we don't teach them. It becomes a very hit and miss. It works for some kids and not others. But you'll notice the other side, one of the biggest impacts, the students being able to report on their own progress, whether that's through grades or meeting expectations. This has one of the single biggest impacts on improving student learning. So it's not about turning it over to kids as much as it's helping them think deeply about the inquiry they're engaged in. So I'll just float this up just to say, inquiry we should see in this. Kids are thinking about framing questions. What we want them to do is see inquiry as a stance. Rather than seeing it as a particular approach to learning that follows a certain set of steps, inquiry is really a learning stance. It's to wonder about and to question, to look for answers. And used effectively, inquiry can enhance problem-based learning, project-based learning, case-based learning, discovery learning. There are multiple approaches to learning that can be enriched from an inquiry stance. But we need to see it more as a way of learning than a particular sequence of events. I'm just going to bring this up for a moment. And this is, and I want to connect it back to WorldVuze and the website in a moment. I'm going to ask you to think about how engaged your students have been. But before I do that, this was a tweet. And you can see on the visual, it asked the question, are we really looking for engagement? Shouldn't it be empowerment? I took issue with that and tweeted back, well, why do we need to pit empowerment against engagement? Don't we want all students to be engaged and empowered? The response I got was, well, the one difference between engagement and empowerment is whose ideas are students thinking about. So the presumption is that if the teacher frames the question, it's no longer engagement, and if the student does, it is engagement. But I want to suggest to you that first of all, that's a misunderstanding of engagement and what it means to engage. Engagement is to freely commit to. It comes from the French word to commit to. And we need our children to engage as learners and as citizens. Notice the presumption on the left is that engagement is kids answering our questions, but empowerment is kids answering their own. I disagree and said that engagement is kids committing to learn, and that our job is to frame learning in a way that kids are inspired to want to learn and see relevance. And to empower them is not getting out of the way, as suggested by an earlier slide, but instead it's really about giving them the intellectual tools and the digital tools to help them do the thing. So I think Quentin earlier mentioned the need to have access to information and ideas. That's making effective use of digital tools and intellectual. When I find stuff online, how do I know I can trust it? How would I scrutinize it? And the last 2 points, if you want to nurture innovation and creativity, you must teach kids some background knowledge, because you cannot innovate in a field that you know little about. The teachers do need to help kids assemble enough information that they can begin to think about the issue. But my last caution, building background knowledge does not mean that that's where I'm transmissive in my teaching. It should mean this is where I attempt to build background through rich discussion. So notice, building background knowledge with kids is not to say that I don't engage in thinking. Our challenge is how do we build that background. So I told you a moment ago I wanted to pause for a moment, and I'm going to ask you if you would mind. Just think about inquiry as a stance, some of the things I've been talking about. And those of you who have used WorldVuze, if you could just share a couple of thoughts on WorldVuze and how it can support meaningful inquiry. Would you just share, again, mic or typing? So I'll just give you a minute to share some thoughts with those who may not have used WorldVuze. How can it support rich, meaningful inquiry? Thanks. This is wonderful. So I give students freedom, the kids, to frame questions. Think about what makes a powerful question. Wonderful. Think about new concepts. Think about different perspectives. What makes powerful questions. So I want to move to that. That's interesting, Anne, that not everyone will answer the same question the same way. There are different ways to respond to a question. An interesting piece on that comment about the way we answer questions. You've heard in the introduction, I work with the Critical Thinking Consortium. You notice in our name, our focus is on critical thinking. And yet, about 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, we published our new book. The name of it, it's called Creating Thinking Classrooms. You'll notice in the title, we don't use the word critical at all. And this is actually for an important reason that connects to what you had just posted. That we came to realize that we shouldn't distinguish between critical thinking, creative thinking, and collaborative thinking. Instead, what we should recognize is that our interest is quality thinking. It's how do we engage kids in rigorous quality thinking. And we realize that thinking has multiple dimensions, and we've identified 3 dimensions. A quality thinking has to have a critical element to it that's responsive, that reacts to something. It has a creative element that is productive, that's imaginative, and it has a collaborative, where we work with others to expand our ideas. So what we want to look at is how does WorldVuze create both that generative, the generation of new ideas, that responding to ideas, and that opportunity to collaborate. So I'm going to ask you a quick question. I want you to post, would you use Pocahontas in a grade 5 social studies class? So grade 5, they look at First Nations. Would you use Pocahontas? And if not, why not? If you could just give you a second, if you wouldn't mind responding to my question. Would you use Pocahontas in a grade 5 social studies class? Okay, some interesting responses. And sorry, I think this female body images. There's one I hadn't thought of. It's an interesting point. Oh, thanks for attending, Anne. We'll see you later. Considering how they're presented, I'm going to show you. By the way, when I asked this question of my students in a social studies class at the university, I got a fairly uniform no, they wouldn't, because of their fear of stereotypes, inaccuracies, and so on. And I love Andrew, only if you had other sources. In fact, I want to give you a framework that you would add to that. And I call it my baloney meter. And so I want to show you just how I'm going to frame questions and how I want kids to think about questions. So my baloney meter invites kids to think about information they're seeing and decide, do you think there's no baloney? This information seems true and accurate to me. There's a bit of baloney, there's some baloney, there's a lot of baloney, this is full of baloney. And I want kids to, I might show them 10 minutes from Pocahontas and invite them to take a position along my baloney meter. Or we'll put a bar and have it on the wall and we'll slide it. And most teachers are asked to tell me, kids in grade 5 are going to say there's either no baloney or little baloney. They're going to be on that end of the scale. And so I said, imagine if we used a baloney meter and we invited students to think about this issue. And every time we go through another lesson, kids are going to be invited to go back to the baloney meter. Are you still convinced that there's little baloney in that movie? Do you think there are other things they got wrong? Do you think there are other portrayals that are stereotypes, cliches? Like, what if we used a provocation, like Pocahontas, problematize it? Is there any baloney in this movie? And kids get to change their mind as they learn. Now, in a WorldVuze context, I think it works equally well for kids to always have to filter. As you hear things from another country, does that jive with what you know to be true? Can we check that against other sources? To float out a position and ask kids, where would you place it? So what I'm doing is simply problematizing. By the way, this is my high school version. It's my crap detector, where I invite kids to take a look at something that they saw online, and does it ring true to you? Does it seem reasonable? There might be some flaws. Is it lacking in truth or veracity? Are there red flags going off for you? Does it smell kind of funky? Does it smell like total crap? This is, I wouldn't use this with younger kids. I don't want to say to their parents, we used a crap detector today, but older kids, in a similar vein to the baloney meter, getting kids to think about, what do you think about your text? And by the way, I want to make the connection back to WorldVuze. Imagine in a course, whether it's a geography course, a history course, whatever it might be, and kids are asked to flip through a textbook that deals with other parts of the world, other parts of the country. How accurately do you think this culture, this country is portrayed in your text? And then you share that with some kids through WorldVuze, and the kids around the world whose countries are being portrayed, for example, bring some clarifications, they challenge the assumptions, and kids can go back to their crap detector and assess how well did the source they were looking at actually work. So I just wanted to show you that what we want to do is invite kids to consider. So I call this moving from knowledge hierarchies, in which we kind of have Bloom's taxonomy, we teach content, we work on comprehension, we work our way to the top. And instead of that approach, move to knowledge networks. And when we work with knowledge networks, we put a provocation at the center. So in framing questions to post on WorldVuze, let's set up some kind of rich provocation that gets kids wondering, that has them wanting to learn more about, and help them frame questions that will help them with their investigation. So to do this, we might have kids reflect on what they think they know already, begin to construct questions in light of that, investigate a bit further to test to see if they should revise their question, maybe share their question with peers in the classroom, reflect on what they heard. Notice what I'm doing is a very dynamic, organic exploration, as opposed to learn content and then work our way up to the top. So I'm watching my time, and I want to get to a couple of key things that we're here for tonight. First of all, we're talking about critical thinking and how we use questions to support critical thinking. So I think it's important that we make sure that we're clear on what we mean by this term. Critical thinking is a term that is widely used in education and has been for generations, but often there's not a shared understanding of what we mean by the term critical thinking. So just to try to bring some clarity, a couple of things you'll notice here. There has to be an invitation to judge. So critical thinking, first of all, is not to criticize. It's not to be critical, but it is to render an assessment or a judgment of some kind. So it is getting kids to weigh options, think about alternatives and options, and to make a thoughtful decision considering the evidence they have and the criteria. So at the core of critical thinking is kids being invited to use criteria to help them make a thoughtful decision. And so you'll see here, these are the 4 attributes that we want to be thinking about when I pose a question. And this is, by the way, my advice would be, you provide this to students when you're creating questions to post on WorldVuze. If they're good critical thinking questions, they should have these 4 attributes. Okay, so 1, does your question allow for the consideration of a variety of options? So, by the way, the baloney meter did that. Do you think there's little baloney, some baloney, or lots of baloney? They might pose a question. My understanding is that around the world, this is, children tend to sit in rows more in classrooms than they do in the West. Is this very true, somewhat true, or not true at all? Right? So notice what I'm doing there, framing the question not to say list information, but inviting kids to weigh options. I want a reasoned judgment when you weigh those options, and that means arriving at an answer, arriving at a judgment or decision, using criteria and using evidence to support. So as kids frame questions, ask them, is there a range of options that could be considered? Okay, Hillary, that's a great question. I'll come back in one moment. Provide a range of options. Have the kids weigh the evidence in light of criteria. So can it still be a yes or no question? Not if students properly understand what critical thinking is. Now, I would agree with you that in many cases, students will misunderstand the question. Notice what I'm doing. Let me give you a quick example. I'm going to type it in the chat box. Just being male, I'm not great at multitasking, so talking and typing. Okay, so if I pose this question to students, is Hamlet a sympathetic character? Hillary, I think that's the kind of question that your concern is that students may answer with a yes or no. Is that correct? Yeah. And absolutely, I agree with you, many students will, but I'm going to suggest to you by the time kids leave high school, they need to understand that question is a judgment question. It's not a yes-no question. Just to give you an example, if you saw that question on a university exam with 30% of your final mark, I highly doubt any of us would simply write yes. We would recognize that's asking me to make a judgment. Kids will not see that initially. We need to help them see it. I'm going to come back to that in 1 second. But notice this question is asking for you, if you look at my four attributes on the side, are there options? Sure. He's a highly sympathetic character. He's somewhat sympathetic. He's not that sympathetic at all. He's completely unsympathetic. I have a range of options. I'd have to make a reasoned or thoughtful decision. First step, what do you mean by a sympathetic character? What's our criteria for a sympathetic character? What evidence can you pull from the play that you could match to your criteria to help you make that decision? Now, I think Hillary's point is kids won't know to them initially. This is why it's important we help kids frame good questions, paying attention to what I put on the screen, and they think about how you respond to those. So, for example, is Hamlet a sympathetic character? If I want to make sure kids don't just say yes, no, but I also want to help them organize their thinking, I'm going to ask kids, is Hamlet a sympathetic character? Identify 3 criteria for a sympathetic character and use evidence to support your answer. Notice what I've just done is I've given kids a structure or a framework that's going to help them in answering the question. A sympathetic character needs to meet these 3 criteria. As I find evidence in the play, I can see whether he did or did not meet, and I can draw my conclusion. That's going to help kids see I'm making a judgment, using evidence, and making a judgment using criteria. Over time, kids start to recognize judgment questions require explanation. But I think it's a very good caution that we should not assume that kids will know that. So I'll just pull this up quickly and show you. What we're trying to get at here is a move from what we would call a traditional approach, where we see our job is to teach answers, and the kids see their job as to remember what was taught, because they're going to be called on to perform on a test or some kind of assessment. And instead, in what we would call a critical thinking approach, my job is not to teach answers. My job is, the student's job is to arrive at a reasonable answer. But notice my job is to help them do it successfully. That means helping them know how to frame good questions, how to recognize or identify criteria, making sure they have background knowledge, something to support. In a WorldVuze context, making sure kids understand the difference between a retrieval question and a thinking question. And that's where I want to get to before we run out of time. This is the framework that we work from to support a thinking classroom. We try to create the environment. WorldVuze is a wonderful platform to create a thinking environment where kids can share ideas, where they can test out ideas, they can learn from each other. If we frame questions properly, we create the opportunities for thinking. And then in our teaching, we want to address these 5 intellectual tools. And by the way, WorldVuze can support many of these. It helps us build, access background knowledge. It helps us apply criteria, use the vocabulary of thinking. What can we infer from that response? Organize your thinking in a variety of ways. And a huge one from WorldVuze is the habits of mind. Empathy, curiosity, these are habits of good thinkers. So I want us to take a few minutes, because the key thing I'm arguing for tonight is students being able to frame powerful questions that supports the learning. I've tried to make the case, and now we'll get to these. I'm going to ask you to just type in, if you would, very quickly. Look at all the questions that we call type 1 on the left-hand side, and tell me something you know that's common across the questions just in the column 1. In the type 1 column, what do you notice about those questions? What do they show? Great. There's little judgment. In fact, I don't think there's any decision required. I haven't asked you to make a decision. Definitive answer. There's no opinion if there is an answer. Allison, so typically how many correct answers would there be? Great. Roxanne, they're looking for a specific response? Yeah, typically there's a single right answer. When you move to column 2, what do you notice that's different about the questions in column 2 from column 1? It's an opinion, invites opinion, great. In type 1, you told me there's typically a single right answer. We're looking for a specific answer. How many wrong answers would there be in type 2? Yeah, notice type 2, there is a decision required, but the decision is within, it's in the gut. You can't be wrong. Would you like to move to Shanghai? No, I don't think so. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I don't know anything about it. Notice there's no judgment you're asking me. You're just asking me how I feel about it. Now, when we move to type 3, you'll notice again there is a judgment required like there is in type 2. But let me ask you this. Type 1, you said there's typically a single right answer. Would you accept more answers in type 3 than you would type 1? Okay. So you seem to be in agreement that type 3 questions are more open than type 1, which are closed. Would you accept as many answers in type 3 as you would in type 2? So in other words, is type 3 as open? No, you'll see type 2 questions, you can't be wrong. But type 3 questions, while open, are not completely open. And what places the limit on what you would accept as a reasonable answer in type 3 is the criteria and evidence. So notice in the type 3 questions, when I ask, would your family's needs be better met in Vancouver or Shanghai, I'm now asking you to say, well, what does it mean to meet your family's needs? What's the criteria? And as you research each place to live in, you organize it around meeting your family's needs or criteria. If you look at the next one, what natural disaster poses the greatest threat to the economy? Well, I'd have to build criteria for a significant threat to an economy. I'd look at the evidence around different disasters and decide which one best meets the criteria. That's the biggest threat. Now, what I'm encouraging is that as kids frame questions, we share a chart like this with them where they think about, am I asking the type 1 question, which is basically a recall? What are 3 things to do in your community? Type 1. What's the favorite thing you do in your community? Type 2. Could you rank order, if I were to visit your country, could you rank order the best activity, and I might define it by a group, the most affordable, safe, and easy to participate in might be 3 criteria. Notice I'm moving it from a 2, what do you like to do, to what would be the best activity for someone visiting. These are the criteria we have to think about. Now, I want to show you very quickly that there's a myth that, if we change the verb, we change the quality of the question. If you take a look at these 3, list 4 battles Canadians participated in World War II, type 1, 2, or 3. I'm sorry, I should make that a question. If you could just type in, are these questions, type 1 to it, do they require judgments? Right, these are type, list battles, assemble evidence, kids will often see as cut and paste, add a title, whatever comes to mind. Now, watch when I do this instead. List 4 significant battles Canadians participated in during World War II. Is that a 1, 2, or 3? So is that a 1, retrieve it, 2, tell me how you feel about it, or 3, make a reasoned judgment? And Andrew said it's a 3, absolutely, because I now have to think about, I can't just list any 4 battles, or the first 4 battles I come across. Instead, I'm being asked to list battles that I consider and I can defend as being significant. I have to unpack my criteria. A significant battle had an impact on the outcome of the war. It had widespread implications. I give a few criteria. By the way, notice, assemble credible and relevant evidence, not just any evidence. Add an effective title to your story. It should be concise, interesting, and informative. So notice the point here, list, assemble, add. I never changed the verb in any of these. What I did is I added a qualifier. So as kids are working with questions, invite them to think about what's the qualifier, the most significant, best, compelling, whatever it might be. That's going to help kids frame questions that invite a judgment. Changing the question, like there's a myth, we ask why questions or how questions, it's a critical thinking question. Not really. If you said to me, how did you get to your office today? I drove my car, I parked it, I walked up. I didn't make a judgment. You asked me a how question. What we want to do is say, was it the most efficient way to get to your office today? Oh, well, what's your criteria for efficient? Well, was it the cheapest version? Was it most timely? And so on. Now I'm making a judgment. And Hillary, yes, co-construct criteria or present them with criteria. I want to give you advice. You can always co-construct, but it takes time. And so if you're always co-constructing, you may find you're saying this is taking too long. Some days I will go in and I will present kids with a set of criteria we're going to use, and I will invite them and we will talk about what each of them mean. So I might invest my time in helping kids understand or unpack criteria rather than trying to get them to generate it themselves. So it will be an instructional decision on my part. I call this, by the way, a wheel of qualifiers. Around the outside, you have 6 ways that we can invite kids to think critically. We can ask them to critique or judge something. Is Hillary Clinton an effective politician? Would be a critique of the piece. What's your criteria for an effective politician? Who's the better politician, Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton? Now I'm going to judge the better or best. Okay? Rework. If you rewrote the ending of a story from a different perspective, how would it sound different? On WorldVuze. If I were to come to your country and celebrate Christmas, how would it be different than whatever that might be? So I'm reworking by change location. Decode, trying to make sense of something using clues or evidence. Design, creating something or performing something. What I've just added here, and it's certainly not exhaustive, but it's words I can drop in as qualifiers very quickly so you can ask your kids, okay, that question you've posed, it's a good question, but it's a recall. I could retrieve it. I don't really have to make a judgment. Could we add one of these words? So identify an argument the author makes. Identify a compelling argument. What's the difference? That's what would be the most likely outcome of this. What are possible outcomes? I brainstorm. Okay, but what's the most likely? I have to make a judgment. So giving kids something like this as they frame their questions, they're qualifiers that can be dropped in. And often, it's a 5-second tweak to their question. It's a good question. It's focused. It's interesting. But there's no judgment. Add one word, and we can tweak it. So I wanted to share that as a tool just to provide kids and for teachers to think about how are we framing a question. So I think we are almost at 8:30. I want to pause just to invite you to see if you have some questions or thoughts. Our intent tonight was to try one go at a web conference kind of connected to WorldVuze, but how we can use critical thinking. Future ones could explore how we can use criteria, how kids use criteria or other elements of But I'm just going to pause there just before I wrap up and just see, was it useful? Could you take this with kids? Can it help ensure that the quality of questions kids are posting are rich so that the quality of responses are better, and that enriches the experience? And it's what we would call digitally enhanced, like truly enriching the learning, that if I blend good pedagogy with this powerful tool, the results we get can be outstanding. So I'm just going to pause, and then I'm going to say, maybe turn to Julie for a final comment. But just love to get your feedback. So if we do another of these useful, too much, too little, any thoughts would be. Okay, great. It's good to see that the ways to tweak questions, and that was our hope, to give you some practical ways that this doesn't have to be, you'll notice it doesn't have to be a lot of extra work in prepping a lesson. It doesn't have to be a lot of extra time in the lesson. But there can be practical strategies that just help us improve the question. Okay, great, wonderful. I'm going to stop there. This is my second web conference of today, 2 presentations, 2 web conferences, a meeting, and a class I taught this morning. So my voice is starting to go, starting to get a bit hoarse. But thanks so much for your time. I'm going to turn it back to you, Mike.
Yeah, I wanted to say just a really warm thank you to Garfield for this really incredible webinar that you presented today, and I'm hoping that and really wanted to thank all of you for joining us tonight on a Tuesday evening, and hope there are so many tools that you can come and take away and use with your class, even right away. I think some really excellent resources, and please let us know. I'll just type in my email, and Garfield, you can feel free to do the same, but maybe even just for me, if you have other ideas for webinars or future things like this that you think would be helpful, feel free to type it in now, or also email us at another time, and we really want to hear your feedback. And again, thanks so much, and we'll let you have the rest of your evening.